December 19th, 1944. The forests outside Novalet, Belgium, groaned under the weight of frost. It was just past 11 p.m., and a bone-deep cold crept through every inch of metal and flesh. Inside the turret of a Panther tank, a young German officer named Klaus Wendel struggled to write in his notebook. His pencil, wrapped in thick gloves, scratched hesitantly across the frozen page. The Americans have something new. We hear them, never see them, and then, gone. 3 Tigers destroyed yesterday, no warning, no mercy. The lamplight from inside the turret flickered as Wendell paused, lifting his eyes to the cupola. The vast black of the Ardennes forest stretched before him like a mouth waiting to devour. Somewhere out there, he didn't know exactly where, American vehicles were on the move. Fast, silent, lethal. What Klaus Wendell couldn't have known was that in just under 20 minutes, the iron doctrines forged in 5 years of German armored warfare would be shattered, not by overwhelming firepower or brute strength, but by a machine unlike any they'd trained to face. The Panther was an apex predator by German standards. Its sloped armor deflected most Allied rounds. Its 75mm gun could punch through enemy tanks from 2 kilometers away. It was everything German engineers had designed it to be. Powerful, methodical, intimidating. Yet what approached that night wasn't built to duel head-on. It wasn't built to survive hits. It was built to never get hit in the first place. The M18 Hellcat, a tank destroyer so radically different in purpose and form that it defied every textbook Klaus Wendell had ever studied. Its arrival on the battlefield wasn't announced by thunder, but by a scream. The sound of engines revving past 50 miles per hour across icy terrain. By the time a German crew spotted the Hellcat, turned its turret, aimed and prepared to fire, the Hellcat was already gone, firing its shot and vanishing like smoke. Back in the trees, behind a shallow rise of snow-covered earth, American crews of the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion prepared for the dawn. Lieutenant Robert Jennings stood next to his Hellcat, cigarette shaking slightly between his fingers. He'd seen what German armor could do. He'd also seen what his team could do with the right timing and the right training. This wasn't about a direct contest. It was about success, about speed, about acting swiftly and repositioning before a response was possible. This night would be measured in seconds, how many it took to spot the objective, to act, to move, and to succeed. The cold wasn't the challenge. The darkness wasn't the challenge. It was time itself. 3 minutes. That's what the skilled crews believed they had, 3 minutes from first contact to relocation. It was just enough. As one of them adjusted his goggles and peered into the night, a low rumble stirred in the distance. Not loud, not yet, but fast, so fast, it was approaching. The major winter event had entered its 4th day, and in the frozen woods outside Noville, an old kind of warfare was about to die. Robert Jennings dropped his cigarette. "Let's move, boys," he said. The hunt had begun. 3 years earlier, thousands of miles away, the first seeds of the M18 Hellcat were sown not on a battlefield, but on the factory floors of Flint, Michigan. In the dark weeks following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military began re-evaluating its armored warfare doctrine. While the Germans pursued massive, heavily armored tanks like the Panther and Tiger, the Americans were asking a radically different question. What if survival on the battlefield wasn't about being harder to kill, but harder to catch? General Leslie McNair was the architect behind that shift. His vision, a highly mobile force designed not to slug it out toe-to-toe, but to outmaneuver, outpace, and eliminate tanks through speed and strategy. From this directive, Field Manual FM 18-5 was born, containing a philosophy summed up in 3 words: seek, strike, destroy. To build a machine that embodied this mantra, the Army turned to Buick's engineering division in Flint. Joseph Roberts, the chief engineer, stared at the near-impossible list of requirements. Mount a 76mm gun powerful enough to destroy any German tank. Maintain a low profile for stealth, achieve 50+ miles per hour on the battlefield, all within a 20-ton limit. In a world where armor was considered life insurance, this design seemed suicidal. But Roberts understood what few others did. The Hellcat wouldn't need armor if it was fast enough never to be hit. The final design of the M18, barely protected with armor thinner than some German scout cars, was a gamble. Its open-topped turret left crews exposed. Its hull could be pierced by heavy machine gun fire, but it could hit 55 mph and accelerate like a sports car. It was, in effect, a race car with a cannon. Training for this new breed of warfare began in earnest at Camp Hood, Texas, where future Hellcat crews were drilled not just to shoot, but to move, constantly. The doctrine was simple: never stay in one place longer than 30 seconds after firing. Mobility was their shield, stealth their sword. By the time the first Hellcats landed in Europe in 1944, the German Wehrmacht had no idea what was coming. Their training, their doctrine, and their tanks, all built around the idea of slowly grinding forward, were about to be outflanked by something they didn't understand, something American. In early July, elements of the 74th Tank Destroyer Battalion rolled off landing crafts onto Utah Beach. Within weeks, the German lines near Coutances would be hit by Hellcats in what German commanders described as attacks by phantom armor, vehicles that vanished before their turrets could even turn. It wasn't just a new machine, it was a new way of fighting. And while German engineers added more armor and heavier guns to their machines, American crews learned to disappear into the fog, only to strike from a new angle minutes later. The balance of power in armored warfare had begun to tilt. Not through strength, but through speed. Through strategy. 3 minutes. That's all a Hellcat needed. In the coming months, those minutes would be bought with steel, sweat, and lives. But for now, the snow still fell gently in the Ardennes, and the machines of a new war crept quietly into place, waiting for the dawn. The morning of December 20th, 1944, broke over the Ardennes like a cracked mirror. Light filtered through smoke and fog, distorting the landscape into a surreal battlefield. The town of Neuville, just north of Bastogne, was quiet under a blanket of snow. Tall, bare trees stood like silhouettes against the pale landscape. Two groups were moving towards the area, neither fully aware of the challenge ahead. Robert Jennings stood beside his sturdy vehicle, its engine humming softly in the cold air. His team had moved into position overnight, forming an important protective line for the town's inhabitants. Jennings's small group, with just 4 vehicles, had instructions to keep the road leading into town safe and clear. A distant rumble echoed through the trees. Jennings raised his field glasses for a better view. The outlines of impressive vehicles appeared at the edge of the woods, their powerful engines humming as their long scopes swiveled into position. Jennings watched with admiration. This was clearly a highly skilled team, known for their precision and expertise. "Let's begin," he said calmly into his radio. The 3 other vehicles in his group sprang into motion, their engines revving as they turned to face the course. Instead of waiting, they advanced with remarkable speed. Jennings guided his vehicle to the left, moving swiftly along a shallow channel and using an old, weathered barn for partial cover. The open-top design gave his team an excellent, clear view of the field. The lead vehicle from the other team came into sight. Jennings identified the target, and his teammate activated the marker. The 76mm shell streaked through the fog and slammed into the Panther's side armor. The tank jolted, then erupted in smoke. Before Jennings could register the hit, they were already repositioning, reversing hard, turning, moving again. Less than 30 seconds had passed. To the German crews, it was chaos. Enemy fire was coming from impossible angles. The M18s were ghosts, appearing, firing, and disappearing. Panthers turned their turrets, but they were too slow. German doctrine had trained them to fight toe-to-toe. This wasn't a duel. It was a hunt. One by one, the Panthers faltered. Jennings's team scored 5 kills in less than 10 minutes, losing only 1 Hellcat. The destroyed vehicle burned behind a stone wall, a reminder of how thin their armor truly was. Jennings could still see the scorched tracks. He didn't know the name of the crew. He didn't have time to stop. They had delayed the German advance by nearly an hour. That hour would prove critical. Radio chatter reported that reinforcements from the 609th Tank Destroyer Battalion were moving in to reinforce the position. More Hellcats, more speed, more disruption. But the Germans weren't retreating. They were regrouping. Back inside one of the surviving Panthers, Claus Wendell cursed under his breath. His turret was jammed from a hard maneuver. He couldn't track the enemy in time. Each time he glimpsed the American vehicles, they vanished before his gunner could even aim. This wasn't warfare as he knew it. This was something else, something more terrifying than raw firepower. The Americans were rewriting the rules in real time, and somewhere out there, Jennings was already lining up his next shot. The day was far from over. The arrival of the 609th Tank Destroyer Battalion changed the rhythm of the battle. Under the command of Lieutenant David Hagens, 4 additional Hellcats slipped into Noville like ghosts. Their arrival wasn't met with fanfare or roaring engines. It was precise, methodical, and nearly silent. These men didn't need orders to understand what had to be done. They'd been trained for this exact kind of fight. Hagens climbed out of his vehicle briefly to scan the field. Smoke rose from multiple wrecks, both German and American. The air stank of oil, metal, and burned cloth. Somewhere ahead, he knew Jennings's team had already made contact. The snow bore their tracks, weaving in arcs and loops, never in straight lines. Movement, always movement. Back in his Hellcat, Hagens coordinated with Jennings over the radio. Their plan wasn't complicated. It didn't need to be. Speed was the weapon. Surprise was the shield. From the opposite ridge, Claus Wendell looked through his periscope and froze. He had just caught a glimpse of an American vehicle streaking across open ground to the east. Fast. Faster than anything he'd seen since the war began. He tried to alert the others, but his radio crackled, then fell silent. Communications were failing. His turret groaned as he tried to rotate toward the movement. He never got the chance. From the forest edge, a Hellcat tore through the snow like a thunderclap, kicking up ice and mud as it fired on the move. The shell slammed into the side of a Panzer IV nearby. The explosion was deafening. Wendell's crew scrambled, their machine now a sitting duck, as another Hellcat emerged from the west. Then another. Jennings's team had returned, joined by Hagens's fresh platoon. Together, they encircled the German formation in a coordinated strike, moving too fast and too erratically for the enemy to pin down. Radio calls buzzed back and forth, every position updated by the second. They were fighting like one organism, not 4 separate vehicles. Another Panther tried to retreat, reversing down the slope, but a Hellcat intercepted from the tree line, blasting it through its rear armor. The crew never made it out. Within 15 minutes, the American destroyers had eliminated 7 German tanks. 4 more were disabled. Only 2 Hellcats had been lost. And once again, they vanished, pulling back into cover, repositioning, vanishing into the smoke and trees. To the Germans, it felt like a phantom force had descended. And it wasn't just the speed. It was the precision, the coordination. Every hit was placed deliberately, every move had purpose. As silence fell again over the forest, broken only by the distant rumble of shifting tanks, Lieutenant Jennings leaned back in his seat, helmet pushed up, face pale from the cold. He glanced at his gunner. "They'll be back," he muttered. The gunner nodded. "So will we." Over the radio, Hagens confirmed the withdrawal point. They had done their job, for now. The battle for Bastogne was far from over, but every minute they bought gave the airborne boys more time to dig in. And that was the point. The Hellcat wasn't built to win the war in one strike. It was built to strike fast, strike hard, and vanish before death could catch it. Another hour passed. Another dawn loomed, and deep in the frozen woods of Belgium, the hunters waited again. Nightfall on December the 20th came early, cloaking the battered town of Noville in a blanket of darkness and dread. Smoke curled into the night sky from smoldering wrecks, German and American alike. The temperature had dropped again, the kind of cold that crept into bones and stayed there. Snow muffled every sound, turning the battlefield into a ghostly graveyard. Inside his tank, Lieutenant Claus Wendell sat in silence. His Panther was still operational, but barely. The crew was exhausted, shaken, and uncertain. Wendell rubbed his temples, listening to the muffled groans of wounded men outside and the distant hum of what could only be American engines. Or maybe it was just the wind. He wasn't sure anymore. Earlier that afternoon, Wendell had watched a fellow crew's Tiger tank, one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable machines, go up in flames after being struck from the side. Not head-on, not in a duel, from the side out of nowhere. It had all happened in less than a minute. That was the most terrifying part, how quickly things changed. How little time they had. He reached for his notebook again, hands trembling slightly from the cold and the weight of everything they'd lost. They strike before we know they're near. We train to fight, they train to vanish. This is not tank warfare, it's something else, something new. We are not prepared. A few miles away, in the ruins of a collapsed farmhouse, Lieutenant Robert Jennings and Lieutenant David Hagens gathered with their remaining crews. They had lost 2 Hellcats during the last engagement, but they'd destroyed over a dozen enemy tanks. The math was brutal, but it favored them. Jennings sat on a broken beam, radio beside him, boots steaming in the cold from his sweat. He stared into the dark woods, mind racing. "This isn't a victory," he said aloud, almost to himself. "It's a delay." Hagens nodded. "That's all we need. Time buys survival." They understood the stakes. The 101st Airborne was encircled at Bastogne. The roads were choked with snow and blood. If the Germans broke through Nouville, it would collapse the entire defense. Jennings and his men weren't just tank destroyers anymore. They were the thin line holding back a flood. As midnight approached, a distant artillery barrage lit up the horizon. The Germans were regrouping. Wendel's unit had received new orders, a dawn push. Break through the American line, crush the defenders, take Bastogne before reinforcements could arrive. But Jennings was already planning for them. He had scouted a new position, an old logging trail with natural cover and an open kill zone. He would move his Hellcats there before first light, because if the Germans came again, and they would, he needed every second. He looked at his men, their faces haggard but resolute. They had fought hard, faster and smarter than any textbook had ever taught them. 3 minutes. That was their window. From the first sound of a Panther's engine to the moment it turned into scrap. 3 minutes to spot, shoot, and scoot. They'd done it before. They would do it again. Jennings stood and gave a single nod. "Let's move." In the cold, in the dark, the Hellcats rolled out. Quiet as snow, sharp as steel, the hunt would begin again before sunrise. Dawn on December 21st came not with sunlight, but with fog, thick, unrelenting, the kind that clung to skin and distorted shapes into shadows. In the logging trail northeast of Nouville, Lieutenant Jennings's Hellcats had taken position hours before first light. Engines idled low, muffled by the trees. Guns pointed toward the narrow pass the Germans would have to cross. Jennings sipped black coffee from a metal tin, steam curling into the fog. He hadn't slept. No one had. The night had been spent checking gear, double-checking radios, and walking the terrain on foot. Every Hellcat was concealed in brush or behind downed trees. The crews were quiet now, focused, waiting. To the south, the sound came first. Not loud, just a low rumble beneath the frost. Jennings tensed. It was like thunder rolling up from beneath the earth. Then the first shadow emerged. A Panther, then 2 more behind it. German armor, heading directly for the trap. Jennings keyed his radio. "Hold fire, let them enter the funnel." On the other side, Claus Wendell stood atop his tank for a better view, scanning the tree line. The fog made everything deceptive. It was hard to judge depth, direction. He sensed they were being watched, but nothing moved, nothing obvious. Still, he felt it, the cold dread of something unseen. Back in the American position, the lead Hellcat held steady. The Panther passed within 200 yards. Jennings gave the command, "Fire." The 76mm roared. The first round struck the lead Panther just behind the turret. Flames shot skyward. Its column halted. Confusion erupted. Another Hellcat fired, then another. 4 Panthers were hit in 90 seconds. One tried to back out, its gun swinging wildly. Jennings's vehicle sprinted forward, loosing a second shot that pierced its side armor. The Germans tried to respond, but their turrets were too slow. Visibility was too low. Their radios crackled with panic. Wendell shouted orders to fall back, but the convoy was jammed in the narrow pass. Hellcats moved again, circling behind, flanking through the trees. One by one, German tanks lit up. Crews bailed where they could, some firing sidearms into the woods, desperate to hit anything. Within 4 minutes, 8 tanks were disabled or destroyed. The fog absorbed the chaos, turning fire into silhouettes, screams into echoes. Jennings's voice came through the radio again. Pull back, shift north, they'll regroup. We hit again in 10. Like clockwork, the Hellcats vanished, their exhaust blending into the mist. Nothing in German doctrine accounted for this kind of warfare. There was no time to respond, no time to think, just reaction, always one step too slow. Klaus Wendell climbed out of his burning panther, coughing through smoke. Around him, others lay wrecked, broken open like tin cans. He stared into the trees, eyes searching for an enemy he never saw. Just sound, just speed. He fell to his knees, not from injury, but from realization. They weren't fighting a conventional enemy. They were being hunted. Back at the new position, Jennings crouched beside his map, plotting the next ambush. He looked up at his crew. "We don't fight fair," he said. "We fight smart." They all nodded, and somewhere in the haze the engines growled again. The next strike was already in motion. By midday, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a battlefield littered with burned-out husks. Blackened steel, twisted treads, and scorched earth marked where the Hellcats had struck and vanished. The smoke hung low, stubbornly refusing to drift, and the smell of fuel and flesh lingered in the air. For Lieutenant Klaus Wendell, the cost of the morning engagement was more than tactical. It was spiritual. He sat on a frozen log near the wreck of his panther, helmet cradled in his lap. Around him, medics worked in silence, pulling bodies from the charred remains. The fight had moved on, but the weight of it lingered. He scribbled into his notebook with numb fingers. "We prepare for confrontation, but this is dissection. We never see their faces. We don't fight. We react. This war is no longer ours." Back with the 75th and 609th Tank Destroyer Battalions, Jennings and Hagens met briefly under the broken canopy of a collapsed barn. Their Hellcats were being refueled and rearmed, mechanics working feverishly in the snow. The latest report, 30 German tanks destroyed in just over 48 hours, with a handful of Hellcat losses. Unheard-of ratios, but Jennings wasn't celebrating. "These numbers don't mean it's over," he said quietly. "They're just going to send more, heavier, angrier." Hagens lit a cigarette. "And slower. We know what to do with slow." Despite their tactical edge, the strain was showing. The men were fatigued. The constant movement, the bursts of adrenaline followed by long, icy stillness. It all wore them down. Some hadn't eaten in days. Others hadn't slept more than a few minutes since the 19th. But they stayed sharp because they had to. Further west, General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne, received word of the tank destroyer's actions. His men were pinned down, running low on supplies, cut off. But the Hellcats were punching holes, creating doubt among the Germans, buying time, fracturing momentum. He turned to his aide and said, "Tell those destroyer boys to keep dancing. Every hour they hold, we hold." For the German command, the story was different. Reports from the front lines were confusing. Tanks were being lost in ambushes. Enemy vehicles appeared where no armor should be. Communications were breaking down, and field commanders began second-guessing every advance. In some sectors, entire panzer divisions paused, waiting for clarity, time the Allies desperately needed. That afternoon, a small engagement near a crossroads west of Neuville turned into a rout. A single Hellcat crew, separated from its platoon, destroyed 3 German vehicles using only speed and cunning, looping around a churchyard, firing from behind headstones, and disappearing before enemy guns could track. Jennings heard about it on the radio. He smiled. "They're starting to think we're everywhere." And in a way, they were. The Hellcats were becoming legends whispered among German troops. Fast, silent, invisible. Death on tracks. As night returned and temperatures plunged again, Jennings gathered his crew around a fireless camp. No warmth, no smoke to give away their position. Just rations and silence. "Tomorrow's not going to be easier," he said. "They're adapting, so do we." No one answered. They didn't have to. They were ready. Somewhere out there, Wendell's new tank rolled into position. Reinforcements had arrived. The next round was coming. December 22nd began under a sky heavy with snow. The sun barely broke through the clouds, casting the Ardennes in a dull grey gloom. Snow fell silently, coating wreckage, men and weapons alike. In the stillness, the battlefield seemed frozen in time, but beneath the snow, the war pulsed on. In Bastogne, surrounded on all sides, the 101st Airborne Division braced for another assault. Ammunition was running low, food scarcer, but morale held, bolstered by rumors of reinforcements, by the sound of tank destroyers still in the fight. At a forward staging point north of the town, Lieutenant Jennings reviewed the latest aerial reconnaissance photos. German armor was massing again. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was pushing from the east. If they broke through the Hellcat's screen, Bastogne would fall. Jennings turned to Huygens. "We hit them before they move. One more hammer swing." Huygens nodded, pointing at the map. "Here, this rise along the river bend. We strike from both flanks. Catch them in the choke." By noon, 12 Hellcats from both battalions were in motion. Snow muffled their movement. Drivers navigated by memory and instinct, skirting frozen rivers and winding trails. These weren't polished roads, just frost-covered paths barely wide enough for the 20-ton machines. Meanwhile, in the German camp, Klaus Wendel sat inside a newly assigned Panther. Fresh supplies had arrived, and his unit had orders for a renewed push. He stared at the map, already predicting where the Americans might be. "They know this terrain better than we do now," he muttered to his driver. "They fight like part of it." The German advance began around 2 p.m., a slow, methodical crawl through the woods led by a column of tanks and mechanized infantry. The strategy was brute force, overwhelm, push through. They never reached full formation. From the trees above the river, the Hellcats opened fire in unison. The first volley took out the lead tank and the rear guard simultaneously. Panic rippled through the German column. Before gunners could adjust, another volley ripped into their center. Jennings's unit appeared from the right flank, moving at full speed, firing on the move. On the left, Huygens' platoon struck from elevation, shells crashing down like thunder. The Panthers, though powerful, were pinned. Their turrets couldn't track the angles fast enough. The infantry scattered. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. 14 German tanks destroyed, 6 vehicles abandoned, 3 Hellcats lost, 1 to direct fire, 1 immobilized in a ditch, 1 struck by a mine. The surviving crews were shaken but alive. Jennings stood beside the wreckage of a Panther still smoldering, its crew gone. He exhaled slowly. His own Hellcat had taken a glancing hit but was still operational. "We're not ghosts," he said to his driver. "They just can't keep up." Word of the strike reached Bastogne that night. Cheers rang out in frozen bunkers. The defenders knew the line had held. Back in the German sector, Wendel stared at the ruins of his second tank in as many days. He said nothing, just stared. He finally turned to his crew. "They're not fighting a war," he said. "They're performing a ritual, and we're the offering." Another night fell. Another German push failed, but the war wasn't done. Not yet. December 23rd arrived under clear skies for the first time in days. The snow stopped. The fog lifted. For the American forces in Bastogne and across the Ardennes, the blue morning sky brought something even more precious than visibility: hope. With the weather cleared, Allied aircraft roared overhead, dropping supplies and striking German positions. Paratroopers in Bastogne watched the parachutes bloom like flowers in the sky. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, even cigarettes. The siege wasn't over, but it no longer felt hopeless. For Lieutenant Robert Jennings and the Hellcat crews, the clear weather meant something else: exposure. The fog that had once cloaked their movements was gone. Every maneuver, every strike now risked being seen from miles away. But Jennings didn't flinch. He adapted. By mid-morning, he and Huygens had repositioned their units along a winding hillside east of the town. From here, they could monitor the roads and catch any German armor attempting to exploit the improved visibility. Jennings stood beside his Hellcat, eyes locked on the horizon, binoculars raised. "They'll think the sky gives them cover," he said. "Let's remind them the ground doesn't." At the same time, Klaus Wendel sat inside a hastily reformed German armor unit. Reinforcements had arrived overnight, fresh Panthers and King Tigers. The Luftwaffe had promised air cover now that the clouds had lifted. Morale was cautiously rising, but Wendel wasn't celebrating. He had seen too much. He'd watched too many columns vanish under the fire of unseen enemies. He had learned to expect the strike before the silence ended. The next engagement came just after noon. A German armoured column began its push toward a northern gap near Chans, aiming to flank Bastogne. Jennings's scouts spotted them within minutes. Column, 24, mostly Panthers, few transports, North Ridge, Grid Bravo 2, came the radio call. Jennings responded without hesitation. Deploy teams Echo and Delta, intersect at ridgeline, set trap at the curve, wait for lead vehicle to pass. The Hellcats moved swiftly, splitting into pairs, positioning themselves behind natural cover. No smoke, no sound, just waiting. The Germans advanced cautiously but confidently. They believed their superiority in armor gave them the edge, and for a moment it did. Until it didn't. The lead Panther crested the ridge. A flash from the trees, a hit. Smoke erupted from the engine block. The column halted. Confusion again. Panic. More fire. Another tank struck from the side. Then another. Hellcats revealed themselves in synchronized movements, firing, repositioning, firing again. Always moving. From his Hellcat, Jennings watched the Germans attempt to swing their turrets. Too slow. He radioed a flank move. One Hellcat accelerated around the ridge, circling behind. The German column was boxed in. 18 minutes later, it was over. 11 German tanks destroyed, 4 immobilized, dozens of infantry casualties. The rest retreated, abandoning vehicles. Back at HQ, American commanders marked another small victory on the map. Jennings didn't. He marked fuel levels, ammunition counts, crew injuries. Wendell, surviving again by inches, scribbled in his notebook from a transport truck. They come from nowhere. They vanish into smoke. Every time we move, they are already waiting. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow, Jennings's team returned to a makeshift camp. No one smiled. No one spoke. They simply cleaned their weapons, counted their shells, and waited. The sky was clear, the path ahead uncertain. But they were still here, still hunting. Christmas Eve, 1944. The snow returned. It wasn't the gentle kind, but a sharp, wind-driven flurry that painted the Ardennes in shades of white and grey. In the American positions around Bastogne, soldiers dug deeper into foxholes, wrapped themselves in wool blankets, and stared out into a landscape that looked more like a graveyard than a battlefield. Inside a tent made from canvas and camouflage netting, Lieutenant Jennings scribbled a note home he'd never send. His gloves were off, fingers red and raw from the cold, the pencil shaking in his grip. Still breathing, snow's thick, Germans keep trying. We keep stopping them. Tell Dad I remembered what he said about moving targets. We're all moving now. At the far edge of the sector, the 75th and 609th Tank Destroyer Battalions had formed a rotating patrol strategy. Hellcats would operate in teams of 2, constantly shifting positions every few hours, striking small columns and retreating before reinforcements arrived. It was a war of motion and attrition. That afternoon, a lone Panther advanced down a narrow forest road outside of Sibret, testing the lines, probing for weakness. It moved slowly, cautiously, its gun aimed at every shadow. Jennings's Hellcat had been waiting. The ambush was quick. One shell, one shot, directly into the side armor. The Panther never fired a round. It burned quietly in the snow, the flames muffled by falling powder. The crew never saw their attacker. Back in the German command post, Klaus Wendell stood before a map full of red X's. Every path into Bastogne seemed blocked. Every push had been met with invisible fire. His superiors barked orders, demanded action, but Wendell knew the truth. They're not defending the town, he said under his breath. They're defending time. Indeed, time was the real currency. Every hour the Hellcats bought with their hit-and-run tactics gave the Allies more room to breathe, more space for Patton's Third Army to punch through from the south. And those hours were adding up. On Christmas Eve night, as German artillery pounded Bastogne in a last-ditch attempt to break morale, Jennings's crew sat huddled inside their Hellcat. They shared coffee brewed over a tiny flame, passed around chocolate bars sent in care packages, and listened to distant shelling as if it were thunder far away. No songs, no decorations, just silence and cold steel. Jennings finally spoke. "This is what we're doing it for," so they can have their Christmas somewhere else, safe. Nobody argued. In the darkness, Claus Wendell sat alone, his journal open, his gloves discarded. He didn't write. He just stared at the page, listening to the wind and wondering how it had all unraveled. How the mighty Wehrmacht had come to fear a machine that moved like a ghost and struck like lightning. Back in the American sector, the radio crackled. Patton's lead tanks were 12 miles out. 12 miles. After a week of blood and fire, the end was drawing closer. Jennings leaned back, staring at the icy roof of his turret. "Merry Christmas," he whispered. And in the distance, through the trees and smoke, the sound of engines, American engines, grew louder. December 25th, 1944. Christmas morning. But in the Ardennes there were no carols, no wrapped gifts, no peace. The only light came from the fires of destroyed armor, and the only sounds were the crunch of boots in snow and the low growl of engines moving cautiously through pine and frost. Lieutenant Robert Jennings woke stiff and sore inside his Hellcat, breath visible in the frozen air. His hands instinctively checked the radio first, still working. Then he reached for a can of rations. No feast, just cold beans and half a chocolate bar. "Merry damn Christmas," muttered his gunner, Thomas. But Jennings couldn't afford sentiment. Reports had come through at dawn. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was making one final push into Bastogne. It was now or never. Jennings had seen enough to know desperate moves were often the deadliest. They rolled out fast, snow spitting beneath their treads. Hagens's platoon followed closely, flanking to the north. Their mission, delay the advance, force a withdrawal, and buy just a few more hours for Patton's columns to arrive. As the Hellcats reached the ridgeline overlooking a frozen clearing, Jennings spotted movement. German armor, 6 Panthers, accompanied by infantry creeping along a tree line. Not a full charge, more like a slow, measured probe. But even so, if they got through here, Bastogne would be exposed. Jennings keyed the radio. "Targets in sight, begin Patton Charlie, fire and move." The first shot came from Hagens's rightmost Hellcat, hitting a Panther's side and igniting it in seconds. The Germans returned fire, but the Hellcats were already gone, shifting to secondary positions. Jennings's crew fired next, hitting a second tank dead on. A volley of machine gun fire erupted from the German infantry, pinging harmlessly off trees and ice. Another Hellcat burst from the woods like a comet, struck a third Panther, then vanished into the smoke. The battle was a symphony of motion, Hellcats darting from cover to cover, radios buzzing, shells flying. The Germans, caught off guard again, tried to organize a response. But their turrets turned too slowly. Their formations couldn't adapt to a fight without lines. Jennings's vehicle took a glancing hit. A shell scraped across the rear hull, blowing off a storage rack. "Close, too close," he barked. "Move, left tree line, 200 yards. The driver gunned it. They slid across ice, barely dodging a second round. They fired again before halting, knocking out the fourth Panther. Within 15 minutes, the attack had collapsed. 4 German tanks destroyed, 1 abandoned, dozens of infantry retreating into the trees. The last tank tried to reverse but hit a mine and erupted in fire. Jennings stood outside his Hellcat, watching smoke curl into the grey sky. Hagens drove up beside him, climbed down, and handed over a dented thermos. "Hot coffee, courtesy of a grateful paratrooper." Jennings took a sip and nodded. "That's 5 today." Hagen smiled grimly. "And it's not even noon." Further south, the first Sherman tanks of Patton's Third Army crossed into Bastogne's outer perimeter. American troops cheered, hugging each other in snow-covered streets. The siege was broken. Relief had arrived. But the men in the Hellcats didn't cheer. They weren't done. Not yet. Across the ridgeline, Claus Wendell stared at the smoking remains of another German column. He didn't speak. He didn't write. There was nothing left to say. December 26, 1944. The siege of Bastogne was officially broken. American tanks from Patton's Third Army rolled into the battered town, welcomed by the exhausted defenders of the 101st Airborne. The relief brought a temporary calm, but for the men of the 75th and 609th Tank Destroyer Battalions, the battle wasn't over. It was simply changing shape. Lieutenant Robert Jennings sat beside his Hellcat that morning, boots off, socks steaming in the cold. His eyes were bloodshot, but alert. Beside him, Hagen stood in conversation with a logistics officer. Fuel was being rationed, ammo was low, and mechanics were working without sleep. They'd won. But barely. And even now, German armor lingered in the forests outside the town, trapped, desperate, still dangerous. Jennings received new orders shortly after sunrise. His unit would be leading a sweep eastward, flush out any remaining enemy armor, prevent a regrouping. It wasn't glory work, it was mopping up. And that made it even more dangerous. Klaus Wendell, now reassigned to an ad hoc rearguard unit, knew it too. He sat with a handful of surviving crew members in a frozen barn outside Hufalize. Supplies were gone, morale was lower, and the myth of German invincibility had burned with every panther left smoldering in the snow. "They don't fight the way we were trained to fight," one crewman muttered. Wendell didn't respond. He was thinking of the last 3 minutes of every battle, how fast the Hellcats moved, how precise their strikes were, how they never seemed to stay still. In the woods east of Bastogne, Jennings's platoon made contact again just after midday. A pair of retreating Tigers attempted to break through a narrow valley pass. The Hellcats were already there. Jennings ordered a pincer maneuver. 2 Hellcats moved high into the tree line, angling for shots on the thinner top armor of the Tigers. The other 2 flanked low. A coordinated strike. The first Tiger was hit from above, one shell, then another. It didn't explode, but the engine died. The crew bailed and ran, disappearing into the trees. The second Tiger fought back, firing a shell that gouged a tree beside one Hellcat, sending snow and bark flying. Jennings called in a shot. His gunner adjusted, fired. The shell struck home, just beneath the turret ring. Smoke poured from the hatch. It was over in 6 minutes. Jennings dismounted, walking toward the ruined Tiger. The snow was deep here, unmarked but for treads and footprints. He peered into the hatch, saw the lifeless forms slumped inside. He didn't linger. Back at command, the kill count was updated. The 75th had destroyed nearly 40 German tanks during the siege at a cost of 6 M18s. Jennings didn't celebrate. He made notes: fuel remaining, ammo count, crew status. Later that night, as his men sat around a small campfire, finally allowed to burn one, Jennings spoke softly. "They threw everything they had at us. Tigers, panthers, whole divisions, but they never figured out how to catch us, not once." A quiet nod came from Thomas, the gunner. "Because we never stopped moving." In the distance, across a field strewn with the relics of broken armor, Klaus Wendell walked alone toward a waiting truck. He looked over his shoulder at the snowy woods. "They weren't machines," he whispered. "They were shadows with teeth." The Hellcats had left their mark, and they weren't done yet. By the final days of December 1944, the tide of the Ardennes had turned. German forces, battered and stretched thin, began withdrawing across the front. The offensive that once promised to divide the Allies had faltered. Crushed by stubborn defense, unrelenting cold, and a new kind of warfighter, the American tank destroyer. The M18 Hellcat had not just performed well, it had redefined armored combat. At a temporary staging area near Bastogne, Lieutenant Jennings stood before a row of snow-dusted Hellcats. Some were scratched, dented, scorched. Others were riddled with bullet holes or marked with black soot from near misses. But they were still standing, and so were their crews. Jennings met briefly with a major from Division Command. "Your battalion held the flank longer than anyone thought possible," the officer said. "You gave the 101st and Patton the space to breathe." Jennings didn't reply right away. He looked at the map spread over the hood of a jeep. "We didn't hold the line," he said quietly. "We never stayed still long enough to hold anything. We moved. We struck. We moved again. That's how we survived." In the German rear, Klaus Wendell and what remained of his unit retreated east, abandoning ruined tanks along roads choked with snow and ice. Their Panthers and Tigers, masterpieces of engineering, were often left behind, too heavy to move without fuel or parts. Wendell stared out the back of a supply truck, watching a Tiger II sink deeper into a snowdrift, useless, a monument to a doctrine that no longer worked. He opened his journal one last time. "We built fortresses, they built hunters, we trained to endure, they trained to vanish, and in the end, speed beat strength. We were never ready for that." By New Year's Eve, Jennings and his battalion received orders to push forward, clearing towns, securing roads, chasing what was left of the retreating Wehrmacht. The M18s moved with practiced ease, engines humming, tracks slicing through the snow like razors. In a small village near the Luxembourg border, a final engagement unfolded. A pocket of German resistance, 2 King Tigers and a handful of anti-tank guns attempted to hold a crossroads. Jennings's platoon approached from the south. Hagen's flanked from the north. The Hellcats used speed, angles, and cover to their advantage. 1 King Tiger was taken out with a side shot as it tried to rotate its turret. The other was abandoned after a track was destroyed. The guns were silenced in under 10 minutes. Jennings stood at the edge of the crossroads, snow falling gently around him. The war wasn't over. But this fight, the Hellcats' fight, was nearing its end. He walked back to his vehicle, running a hand along its hull, paint chipped, armor thin. But it had done what no one expected. It had survived. More than that, it had won. The story of the Panther and Tiger was one of power. The story of the Hellcat was one of purpose. As dusk fell on the battlefield, Jennings gave the order to move. One more town to secure, one more line to cross. They rolled forward into the dark, their engines echoing down empty roads. Always moving, always hunting. January 1945 brought with it not only a new year, but a new reality. The German offensive in the Ardennes had failed. The once-feared panzer divisions were in retreat, shattered by exhaustion, cold, and a relentless enemy that had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. For the crews of the M18 Hellcats, there was no parade, no fanfare, just orders to advance, to clear, to hunt. The war had not ended. It had simply shifted direction. Lieutenant Robert Jennings stood in the ruins of a Belgian village, now quiet after days of fighting. Children peeked from doorways, their eyes hollow but curious. Women offered bread and coffee to the Americans, gratitude wrapped in frostbitten hands. Jennings smiled faintly as a little girl pressed a dried flower into his glove. He didn't speak the language, but he understood the gesture. He nodded, tucked it into his coat, and walked back to his vehicle. Nearby, Hagens and his crew were refitting a Hellcat with a new road wheel, laughing despite the cold. Somehow they were still standing, still functioning, men and machines bonded by fire and survival. Across the front, American commanders took note of what had happened in the Ardennes. Reports came in from unit after unit. Hellcat battalions had inflicted catastrophic losses on German armor. The numbers were startling, kill ratios reaching 5 or even 6 to 1, not through brute strength, but through agility, planning, and a refusal to stand still. At Fort Hood back in Texas, where many of these men had trained, word spread of what their graduates had done. The term shoot and scoot became more than doctrine. It became legend. On the other side of the lines, Claus Wendell sat with a different burden. His unit had been pulled back to reorganize, but there was little left to rebuild. Most of their tanks were gone, and the new replacements, barely trained, barely adults, had no memory of victory. In his journal, Wendell wrote one last entry. "We believed the tank was a castle. They proved it could be a dagger. The Hellcat wasn't just a machine, it was a philosophy, and we never had an answer for it." That night, Jennings joined his men around a small fire. It was rare, almost forbidden. But they needed it. The worst was behind them, though none dared believe it. "I don't care what medals come," one of his gunners said. "This right here, us still breathing, that's enough." Jennings nodded. He pulled the dried flower from his coat and stared at it in the firelight. "We weren't the biggest, weren't the toughest," he said. "But we moved. And we struck, and we kept moving." Around him, the snow began to fall again, soft now, gentle. Tomorrow they'd move out once more. The war still raged in the east, but for one night there was silence. The Hellcats had done what they were built to do, and the enemy knew it. From the forests of Belgium to the banks of the Rhine, their story would echo, not in monuments, but in the doctrines rewritten, in the machines that came after, in the fear they planted deep in the steel hearts of Germany's mightiest tanks. 3 minutes, that's all they ever needed. A significant winter campaign would be remembered for its ambitious objectives through challenging, forested terrain. The final outcome was influenced by an innovative vehicle that many had initially overlooked, the M18. On the surface, it didn't seem like a decisive machine. Its light construction and open-top design presented unique challenges for its operators. It wasn't large or imposing. However, it was exceptionally fast and precise. In the hands of skilled crews, it became one of the most effective vehicles of its time, introducing a new way of thinking. While one design philosophy favored creating massive, heavily protected machines, this new approach prioritized swift, agile, and maneuverable designs. The Hellcat didn't wait for the enemy to come. It found them, struck them, disappeared before the turret could turn. For German crews, the experience was disorienting. 5 years of training, of doctrine, of discipline, of method meant nothing against a force that refused to play by the same rules. A Tiger tank might have been a technological marvel, but on the roads and ridges of the Ardennes, it was too slow, too rigid, too late. The Hellcat's success wasn't an accident. It was the result of strategy, training, and a clear understanding of what the battlefield required. Its crews were drilled relentlessly at Camp Hood. They were taught to fire fast, move faster, and never stay still. They fought not to dominate ground, but to control time. And time, in those bitter winter days, was everything. They bought hours. They bought days. They bought lives. In just 15 months of production, 2,507 M18 Hellcats rolled off assembly lines in Flint, Michigan. In the span of one brutal campaign, they changed the course of armored warfare forever. They didn't do it through brute force, but through movement, cunning, and resolve. More than 500 enemy vehicles were destroyed by Hellcats in Europe. At Bastogne, a single battalion delayed an entire German division. In one engagement, a crew destroyed 7 enemy tanks in a single day. Their kill-to-loss ratios remain among the highest of any armored vehicle in American military history. But the statistics only tell part of the story. Behind every successful run was a skilled operator, focused and determined, guiding their vehicle with precision through a demanding course. Behind every maneuver was a team that worked in perfect sync, relying on complete trust and communication. Behind every action was the principle that swiftness was the key to navigating challenges successfully. And it was. The vehicle's design was unique, but it was effective. It was right for the landscape, right for the obstacles, and right for the challenge they were facing. When the dust settled after the great competition, the legacy of this design was confirmed. Not in trophies or records, but in the quiet success of a new idea. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't heavy plating. It's agility, it's expertise, it's the will to move forward when others might hesitate. For the opposing teams, the brief time between the start of the engagement and its conclusion was a defining experience, shaped by a vehicle known for its incredible speed. If this story inspired you, take a moment to appreciate the determination of those who competed not just with power, but with purpose. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what lessons you take from this story. Because sometimes success isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it belongs to those who are the first to act.